This is Lynn Fraser with the Kilby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Summit, and I'm so happy to be here today with Pete Walker. He's written a couple of books that have made a big difference to me personally and in the work that I do with people. And one is Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving, and another one is The Tao of Fully Feeling. And then you've got a fascinating biography too called Homesteading in the Calm Eye of the Storm, which all of these three books are fascinating and I would highly recommend to people. And I'll put the links for those on there. So, welcome. Uh, I'm so happy to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for this opportunity. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you. So, there's a few things that I wanted to pull out of um, the book about complex PTSD. One of the things at the Kilby Center is that we've always worked with trauma first. So sometimes people in recovery centers will kind of stay away from trauma, thinking they need to work with the addiction first. And Scott Kilby has always worked with, let's get at the reason for the drinking, the underlying drivers of addiction. Of course, trauma is a big driver of addiction. And when I started reading your book, I learned a lot about developmental trauma, but there was a couple things that really stood out. One is fawning. So I'd never heard anybody talk about fawning as a strategy with fight, flight, freeze. And can you just explain a little bit about why you've added that and what that is for people who I think people kind of get it, but can you just talk a bit about that?
Sure. I agree with Scott as well, going for in terms of um, recovery and ending addiction, going to the trauma because I see, like Gabor Maté says, I totally agree with him. Every addiction, I mean, there's some people who physiologically got the gene, but everyone I see, it's usually self-medication for trauma or
Hmm.
distraction from trauma. And the first level of that I note is what I call the four F's. That when you're a child in a traumatic situation, you go to instinctive responses and over rely on them in order to um, survive, in order to get some simulacrum of safety and maybe some imaginary experience of being loved and cared for. So the first way we're wired is the fight response. If we're being treated unfairly or being neglected, we get mad. And that's one of the why children learn, one of the first things they learn is to say, that's not fair. And no, no, mommy, don't go away. No, mommy, don't make me stay in the room by myself. And so some people get away with that and develop that into a very narrow lifestyle, which translates for them into becoming a narcissistic type. And they tend to use their anger and their controlling behaviors to try and get the environment or the person to be safe and to be responsive to what they want. Um, in most families, that doesn't, dysfunctional families, that doesn't work. There may be one kid that gets to imitate the narcissistic parent who's doing the abuse. Um, so most kids, they don't get to do that. So the next choice that we have instinctively is flight, is to get away. And many kids, people from trauma will have some memory of at a very early age trying to run away from home. And very rarely at an early age does that work. It's just even scary to be out there. And so that often gets transmuted into an obsessive compulsive type of behavior, an ADHD, just being on the move all the time, either in your mind and the left brain and just thinking all the time, or in action, being busy. And so those types will become obsessive compulsive in in their lifestyle. A third type is when things are so bad in the family and there's so much suppression that the child learns that they can't do anything. They got to just go into the freeze response, a dissociative response, kind of like if you ever seen wildlife thing of a lion catching a small gazelle. At the moment it's caught, it just collapses. In an extreme version of the freeze response is collapse. I give up. I can't do anything. I get in trouble if I fight back. I get in trouble if I'm busy. I get criticism. So I'm just going to space out, dissolve into the TV, these types will tend to go into, in adulthood, into downer drugs, whereas the flight types in adulthood, to keep their busyness going, will kind of go into the upper kind of drugs, those kinds of addictions. And then I discovered in myself at meditating that this fourth response, called the fawn response, and it was just one way of surviving that situation. And this kind of goes with Alice Miller's drama of the gifted child. There's one precocious child in the family that's got innate relational skills, has a bigger heart, and that parent will co-opt that child to be their personal slave and to be their therapist, to be their surrogate partner. And that child learns that they get some little piece of approval and some sense of belonging and safety by being very helpful, by being servile, by being a good listener. And that child can then grow up to be somebody that's codependent and have an unconscious attraction to narcissistic people. So that's what I mean by the form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so people could move through those. For instance, somebody might use anger and fawning.
So there's subtypes. Yeah, you could be, your fight might be your key thing, but your secondary response is to fawn.
Oh, okay. Right.
Yeah. Or you might be a flight type. There's a lot of people that'll be a flight freeze. They'll go and go and go and go until they just totally collapse, and then they be in some kind of depression for days.
Oh, okay.
And the minute they get some energy and come back, they go and go, go, and they're in that cycle of mania and exhaustion. And people that are severe kind of borderlines often shift between the fight and the fawn,
Okay.
like being very, very controlling. But some can develop this acute instinct when they've alienated their slave, and then they'll be really nice in small tidbit kind of ways. I had a mother like that, and so
Okay.
they pick it up, and so they'll give you a little tidbit, so you come back in close again, but it won't be long before you get. And
Right.
so sometimes the person isn't actually even a borderline; they're just imitating some kind of behavior that they've had, where they over rely on these two things: the fight, and the fawn. And one of the terrible things about this, with all addiction, it's narrowing your life. You're really stuck in these responses in a way that really impoverishes you, and can lead to then getting into these are somewhat of process addictions, getting into substance addictions to self-medicate the pain that comes from living so narrowly, being a fight type and alienating everybody, even though you may be able to keep them as slaves, you don't feel loved, or being a flight type and having to go like crazy until the only way you can sleep is to get to exhaustion, or to be a foreign type, getting one exploitive relationship after another,
Mm-hmm. Right.
or being a freeze type and just not finding a place in the world where you can be successful.
Right. And then the isolation and loneliness that goes along with that.
Terrible isolation and loneliness, and that's the bottom of the barrel. Is that these are responses. I see that Scott talks about. There's a quote from him: "Addiction falls away when the pain underneath is healed." And the
Mm.
bottom of the barrel of the pain is what I call the abandonment melange.
Mm-hmm.
It's the depression the child feels from being abandoned, not being seen as special, not being having anybody they can go to for protection or to get their needs met, eventually abandoning themselves in the same way they've been abandoned. And around that abandonment, the feeling, when the feeling of abandonment is like a death feeling. It's just like, what's the point of being here? Nothing works. And as human beings, we need at least one other safe interaction to keep our homeostasis going. And so when we when we're in an emotional flashback, we fall back into that abandonment depression, but we can't even feel the depression. It's too scary. So there's a lot of fear and shame that comes with it. And we can get lost in the shame and the fear, feeling hopeless and helpless and self-blaming. And ultimately, we've got to learn how to stay present to that and learn how to use our psyches to feel compassion for ourselves in that place and to develop a narrative to help us understand that we're not defective, that this was a normal response to being abandoned. In a later relationship in your life, you may be feeling this again, and there might be some emotional intelligence because you've got a narcissistic partner who's not feeding you in a mutual way. But
And a big driver of that disconnection is the inner critic. And I
yeah,
know you talk a lot about that. Can you talk about that in terms related to addiction, but just generally too? So many people are not on their own side, have no kindness for themselves. How do you go from kind of hating yourself or shaming yourself or just being lost in that to having a kinder regard for yourself and a friendship?
yeah. So I outline a process in the complex PTSD book, and it's kind of linear through the chapters. In the first four chapters, in chapters 1 and 2, I outline the process, and then each chapter talks at levels of being able to work through that bottom line pain so that you can rebuild your relationship with yourself so that you're not all in a critic. Because from so on the first level, when we're traumatized, we have these behavioral responses. So I do a lot of psychoeducation with people in the book and in person to understand how, well, you're just stuck in these behaviors, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and it's really limiting your life, and it comes from the trauma. And when you start to understand that, then we move down to the next level, which is the inner critic. And we start to see through mindfulness and through psychoeducation, paying attention to your process, you start to see, holy mackerel, I'm so hard on myself. The word I like to use for it these days is uh, I only notice myself in a negative way. I have two processes going on here. I'm looking at what's wrong with me. If I'm a fight type or a freeze type, I'm also looking at what's wrong with the world. And that's
Hmm.
all I see, total negative noticing. And then I expand that into myself, noticing myself in a negative way. Um, and then the other key process is endangerment. I'm just drasticizing and catastrophizing, hypochondriacizing about all the terrible things that are going to happen to me, which reflected all the terrible things that did happen to you as a child, but projecting them on people that, aren't dangerous. So a lot of psychoeducation around this process. I have in the chapter 9, it's called Shrinking the Inner Critic, and it looks at 14 different ways the inner critic, like our parents, attack us with perfectionism, with time urgency, with drasticizing, with catastrophizing. And I have things that we can say to ourselves to contradict that. So, on working on this cognitive level, it's first understanding how we're ruled by this terrible perfectionism and negative noticing, and shifting to a more positive perspective of ourselves. And I will often help my clients to see that. I might be the first witness to say, "Hey, you're not all that. You've got a good heart. You're a really smart person. You're
Hmm.
kind. And look at the things you've told me about that you've accomplished. You
Right.
call yourself stupid. You got a PhD. I mean, how could that be? You call yourself ugly. You look attractive to me.
Hmm.
That kind of thing. So these days, when I take that down to the next level, emotional, and this is what I'm doing a lot, particularly in the first couple of years of therapy, is this 1-2 process of noticing when you're attacking yourself, when you're unfairly blaming yourself, and saying no to it. It's a simple cognitive technique of thought stopping. I'm expanding that to say perspective stopping. You're stuck in the same perspective your parents had of you, always negative. And any part of you mad about that? I mean, what if you went back in time and you were 2 and you saw your parents doing that to you? Or if you had your kid or somebody's doing that to them, wouldn't you feel mad? Wouldn't you want to say, no, stop that, don't do that, don't talk to me that way? And, gradually trying to reconnect the person with their healthy anger, the instinct of self protection.
Hmm.
Julia Herman says that the first step in trauma recovery is getting outside safety, which often means like, moving out from abusive parents if you're stuck with them, or moving out from an abusive parent. And this is absolutely true. That's the most powerful thing you can do to start out with. But then the next most powerful thing is to make your relationship with yourself safe. And the majority of emotional flashbacks you start to see are coming from the nasty way you're talking to yourself. You're just reenacting the criticism and just not giving yourself a break, just totally being against yourself. And so it often takes a lot of repetition. And a lot of people tell me they read the book 3 or 4 times, and each time they read particularly the stuff on the critic, it starts to make, oh, uh-huh. Sometimes I read it and I forget I wrote something. I go, oh, wow, God, that's a subtle way that I'm still being hard on myself.
Right. So can we pause here while you say what emotional flashbacks are? When I when I started doing some psychoeducation with people I work with around that, it was like, wow, that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
Waking up with terror or whatever it might be, the shame.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'll just refer to my website really quickly, because if anybody that's listening to this, you can see the emotional flashbacks. On the left-hand side of the homepage, there's an article that says 13 flashback management steps, and that will take you to a page that you can cut and paste. And when I'm getting somebody working with this, that's one of the first things I want them to do is print out the flashback management steps.
Mhm.
5 copies, one for your bathroom mirror, one for your bulletin board if it's a safe place to put them,
Yeah.
one to carry around with you, and couple for friends maybe. And so these are 13 steps of ways that you can help yourself when you wake up in the morning and you're feeling like shit and you don't want to face the day, like you probably woke up so many mornings of your life and you're depressed, you have no energy, you're tired, or you're in the melange of it, the anxiety and shame that controls that. You just wake up and the critic's going and scaring you and telling you it's going to be a terrible day and you're a terrible person and what do you got to offer? And uh, the suicidal ideation that comes with complex PTSD might be there, and you just think, geez, I just wish I could die. I wish a bus would hit me, or that kind of thing. Um, so these are 13 things you can read to yourself, and hopefully you memorize it so that when you catch yourself in an emotional flashback, you just go through these steps and you read them to yourself. And the 13 steps correspond a lot to different levels of working on the trauma in the book, working on the cognitive level. So there's ones about how to say no to the critic and shift your awareness to seeing yourself in a positive way. In the back of the book, there's a chart called 12 by 12. There's 12 categories of noticing yourself in a positive way. I encourage people to print that out, put their qualities down there, their accomplishments, their friends, and start to memorize so that when the critic says, you're a loser, you're no good, you're a piece of shit, shut up. That's you, mom and dad. That's your brainwashing. I may not be able to stop you right away, but from saying that inside my head, but I'm fighting. I'm not agreeing with it,
Right.
and I'm shifting my focus to this stuff, to my history, my narrative that I know about. I just forget when I'm in a flashback. I'm a good person. I'm smart. I'm kind. Depending on you, I'm artistic. I love pets. Did good in school. Blah blah blah. Whatever. And this just becomes a process, and you got to practice it thousands and thousands of times. When I was in the heart of it, I remember I had a mantra for myself, which was, "I love you, Pete." So I'd catch the critic, and I'd be going, "I love you, Pete," and the critic would be going, "No, you don't. You sorry sucker. You don't know shit about love. I love you, Pete." And I read some neuropsychology at that time, which would show that they could see that specific thoughts, there was a neural pathway, and
Right.
that by repetition you can make that neural pathway stronger.
Mhm.
So now for me, it's just automatic. Like I'm in a flashback. Oh, I love you. You're a good person. Don't listen to that bullshit. But it took
Right.
hundreds of thousands of repetition.
Yeah.
But in a year or two, just really going there with that particular step of challenging the critic and then shifting your focus in a loving way to yourself, you can make a lot of progress with that. And so many people tell me the first time they read the flashback management steps, like, holy mackerel, I feel so much better. A big part of the work as a therapist is gradually and gently dissolving the denial and minimization around the bad childhood.
Right.
With some people, you can't force it, so you got to go gently. Some people it takes a long time. Some people read those steps and it's like, whoa, my God, it's not me. I'm not defective.
Right.
You know?
Hmm.
So these are 13 steps that
Yeah.
help in building a new relationship with yourself, where you're becoming your own best friend, and you're
Right.
on your side gradually, more and more and more and more often. Lifetime work. I feel like I'm on my side 95% of the time, but I still wake up in flashback sometimes. And
Hmm.
with flashback, so the flashback is to that condition of being the child that's scared and ashamed
Hmm.
and hungry, just starving for some emotional connection. First addiction
Right.
most people will get is a food addiction, because
Mhm.
that's the one place you got some relief.
Right.
Yeah.
So one thing that's really evident is how long it takes our nervous system to settle and feel safe after we've had a lifetime of abuse or neglect or not being valued and disconnected. And then we have all of the evidence that people are not safe based on our experience. And it takes a while to become safe for ourselves and then to let other people in. And then now we have COVID-19, where in fact other people are not safe. We don't know who has the virus. We're isolated. We're not connecting the way we might have been, or maybe we're just even more isolated than we had been. So, can you talk about that a little bit? What would you say about that?
Oh man, you hit a nerve. I'm feeling verklempt because it's really hard. It's
It,
really hard. I have my
yeah.
thank God my wife's my best friend, and my son, and thank God I have them. But you know, uh, we're much more social than that.
Yeah.
As recovery progresses, you get more safe relationships in your life. So I'm missing that in my life. I got four really close male friends who were my age in their 60s and 70s, and we feel like we can't risk
Mm.
infecting each other. We might be silent carriers and asymptomatic. So it's hard. So it's really hard. And so it is very triggering of these emotional flashbacks into the abandonment. Silver lining, you got more time. You're probably not working, especially if you're not working.
Mhm.
And I'm hearing from a lot of people, I'm seeing in my own clients, that they're putting that time into building this more nurturing and loving and accepting relationships with themselves,
Mhm.
allowing their psyche to not. One way of looking at this is the psyche becomes all superego. The superego is the first development in the child, learning what the rules are so you fit in, and that just goes viral in the brain for the child trying to figure out what the rules are to be safe. And
Mhm.
it's all about perfectionism takes over, which tends to be a superego kind of thing.
Mhm.
And so this is an opportunity to see that more clearly. It's painful, but pain for me is, luckily for me, something in me. I just for a long time, for the last 30 years, I went for the pain. It's like I want to have a relationship with myself where there's nothing inside of myself that I'm going to run away from, avoid, suppress, shame.
Right.
And so going for that right now, and using the book or the flashback management steps to help you realize, okay, I'm not going to pathologize myself because I'm feeling worse right now. It makes sense, of course, it is lonely, and it reminds me of these other lonely times. And oh,
Yeah.
wow, here comes some of it. I need to grieve for that little kid. I need to grieve for that person I was 10 years ago. I need to grieve from the fact that I live in a body in this world, and that loneliness is an existential variable that we all have to deal with sometimes. Sometimes you're just lonely, even when you've got a lot of friends around.
Mhm.
There's nothing, in my experience, that helps you out of that loneliness and dissolves fear like a good cry.
Mm.
It's
Mhm.
just miraculous. I've just had so many experiences. It took me a long time. most of us men have that shamed out. If we didn't have it shamed out in the family, it's shamed out by other men who had it shamed out by them. But when I really got into understanding what that was about and became the best addiction I ever had was trying to find ways that opened up my tears. And because the very first time it happened to me, it was kind of like, oh my God, I was just so relieved. And since I've had thousands of experiences of being in one of those flashbacks where it's obsessive compulsive worrying,
Um,
what if this happens? What about this? And just jumping around in this terrible cognitive kind of pain. And I've had thousands of experiences of being in that place and having a good cry. And it just goes away. It's almost miraculous. It's like, where to go? And I've come to feel like grieving is so important because it's emotional pain, the pain of not being loved, especially by yourself. And when you can cry in self compassion for yourself, it lets out that pain, it lets out that fear, it lets out the shame. And it's like that the fear and the unreleased shame is like the emotional fuel of the negative thinking, the
mhm.
painful thinking. And to the degree that it's accumulated or unresolved, it just fuels that. And I so encourage people to grieve uh, to the to the degree you can do that, and as your access improves, you've got this incredible. And this is one of the steps, flashback management steps.
Mhm.
You temporarily, at least, exhaust the fuel supply, and suddenly your brain is free to look around and go, "Oh my God, the colors look a lot better right now." And look at that bird. Well, how come I didn't notice that?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, something you just said kind of landed on me too, that grief of abandoning ourselves or the grief of not loving ourselves. And even though it's not something we've deliberately done, it's an effect of the trauma.
It's an effect of the trauma. Our
Yeah,
relationship with ourself is based on the relationship that was modeled to us.
right,
Mm. This complex PTSD is also called developmental trauma disorder.
right.
And I like that as a secondary name for it. I like both of them equally. And in
Mm,
my mind these days, I see the biggest developmental trauma is not being allowed to develop a positive relationship with yourself.
right.
It's just the worst thing. To There's no safety in there. There's
Mhm,
nothing but shame, judgment, worrying, and futurizing negative things happening. The good news is with practice and with the kinds of structures that I'm advocating, you can gradually reduce that. The bad news is it's painful to actually see it. Like, oh.
right.
And I used to put it's hard to know whether in terms of the worst developmental trauma, is it in some ways it's that you didn't get the positive relationship. You could say that's the worst.
Mhm,
So I guess they're both the worst. One comment, but no matter how much positive feedback you're getting from the outside world, until you work on the relationship with yourself to open up, to feel like you deserve good treatment, it
right.
doesn't help. But
Yeah, I
usually,
can't.
for when recovery is really good, it's a yin yang process. You're working on the relationship with yourself, and you've got a friend or a recovery group or a therapist who's really safe and affirming and helping you see, when you're mean to yourself and encouraging you to be kind to yourself.
So as you're talking, what I'm thinking about partly is the polarizing of people now and how we so often are. I suspect that part of the reason people can't connect with each other and we see each other as the enemy. And I mean, there's just so much chaos. As we're recording this, we've just had that black man
Oh yeah.
suffocated to death by a police officer in Minneapolis. And that kind of disconnection and inhumanity is hard to stay kind of positive around, like hope for people. It seems to me like people are so traumatized and so disconnected. How are we going to find our way back to some kind of kindness for ourselves and each other.
One way is to try and protect ourselves to go from going into all or none thinking
Hmm.
about people's unkindness, because it isn't everybody.
That's
And
true.
part of the dangerousness of these times is that the news is so bad, and the news has to be focused on the code we need to know in order to try and get some kind of safety. But paradoxically, if we're too saturated with it, then we're feeding the inner critic. It's almost like subtext for the critic is, see, I told you the world's a shitty place and terrible place to be. And
Right.
we can miss out on seeing that there are kind people, and there are good enough people. And in fact, I take a lot of heart. I'm really blessed for my book to have done well and get lots of really kind, validating messages from people, and hearing their stories about how they are getting rid of narcissists in their life and making better relationships. And personally, I believe that we are evolving, even though the evidence around us looks pretty dire. I think evolution has always been something, in contemporary evolution, I mean, in traditional evolution, it's the moth that comes out with a slightly different coloring in its wings that makes it safer. And
Hmm.
that one starts to propagate more. And I think with people, it's the same thing. There's regressive, Trumpian kinds of people, narcissistic people in charge, that are making us look like we're only devolving. But there's always been some human beings that are evolving and that believe in kindness and compassion. And I'm very heartened by just online how many groups there are, recovery groups and support groups, and just hear about more and more. You could just Google any support group for any kind of common problem, and you find a list of people to help. So I think there is a small percentage of the population, maybe not that small, maybe 10%, maybe 20, that are evolving. The lifetime growth that the gerontologists tell us, the lifetime learning that the gerontologists are telling us is necessary to avoid Alzheimer's. A life of learning, a life of expansion, a life of knowing more. And you see a lot more of it on the coasts than in the centers, but I think any big cities has sanctums of this kind of thing, and I take part in that.
Hmm.
So I want to be moderate in following the news. It's
Right.
really hard sometimes. It's so easy to read every article and get sucked up in everything,
Hmm.
and the news sells itself by being hyperbolic and hysterical, and will get you into kind of one symptom from one person out of the hundred of the million. You're all going to get that, you know. So trying to filter it out and cultivate, part of cultivating this positive relationship with ourselves is developing habits, intellectual habits, behavioral habits that make us feel good about being here. So many people tell me about how nature has saved them when they were
Hmm.
a kid, getting
Yeah.
out in nature, seeing beauty. Uh,
Hmm. And we need to protect ourselves from too much of the news, partly because it really hits on our fear response, and then we go back into fight, flight, freeze, fawn.
exactly.
Yeah. So one thing I'm noticing is there's a certain amount of um, peer pressure in a way, maybe, or compliance around masks and how people are social distancing or not. Um, do you want to just maybe, if there's something you want to say about that, how do people work with that? You're in an environment, for instance, a friend of mine was at a 90th birthday party for her dad, and everybody else there was, no one was wearing a mask, everyone was hugging him. This was just a couple days ago. And she felt really awkward, not with her mask and socially distancing. How do we kind of stay steady in the face of that kind of pressure? And I think it probably works the other way too.
Yeah. The first thing that comes to my mind is, well, not expecting ourselves to stay steady with it. I mean,
Mhm.
it we are a divided country politically, and there, There's always, that's part of duality. It's part of the Tao of human existence, conservatives and liberals. And um, there are going to be some situations like the hard one you just described. How awful! I mean, how do you handle that? It's kind of like, you know, if it was me, I'd make them all go home. But
Yeah, it's a hard
maybe my grandfather doesn't want that. Maybe that's part of the thing. So at first when I saw people without masks, it made me upset. Then I realized this is just how it's going to be. Some people are going to do it, some aren't, and
one.
um, I want to choose my battles. I don't want to get stuck in the negative outer critic noticing of it and have all my upset just kind of go into being pissed off at them. And it's understandable to me why some people would. It's understandable why those people are demonstrating against it. I mean, they're on their last paycheck. They're probably on their last paycheck 5 weeks ago, and they're scared
Mm,
shitless.
right.
I feel for both sides of it, and it's hard.
Mhm.
And I hope and pray that that this thing is winding down.
So one of the things that you really stress is being able to feel. And it's so hard when people are in pain to turn towards that. Can you talk about that a little bit? How do you encourage people? Or, I mean, I think part of we're encouraged because when we try it, it works, we feel better.
Mhm.
How do you get to that where that's just what you want to do? You want to go in and feel what's here.
Yeah. I'm doing a lot of psychoeducation with people, and particularly about the need to grieve, the need to have. So I say there's two other key um, relational developmental arrests in terms of the developmental trauma disorder. One is the arrested self-protection, which is based in healthy anger. This
Hmm.
one, and one of the first things that kids are really fine-tuned to see fairness. And I think because fairness is a fundamental part of intimacy, to the degree that we treat each other as equals, to the degree that I'm as interested in you as you are in me, to the degree that we each have a vote on what we're going to do, what we're going to choose, um, and then to the degree that we welcome the whole other person to be there. We're not going to be unfair and expect them to be up all the time because that's impossible.
Right. Hmm.
Um, to that degree, have we gotten our sense of self compassion back and relational compassion back? And so I'm preaching a lot about self compassion and this idea of the addictions, the being stuck in the four F's, being stuck in negative noticing, creates more pain. It's just less. It's a more lingering, ongoing pain that you've kind of gotten used to, but it's causing all these deficits in your life. And that there's a way to move through a lot of that, and that's through grieving. Grieving lets the pain come out in the way through these mechanisms that are part of our true nature. And when we can give that to each other, when we have a cry together, or I make you feel safe enough, you could have a good cry. Because I've seen the same thing with my clients. They come in, they're just full of worry, and we finally got to the place where, hey, your critic's really bumming you out for this, and it seems to me like, well, yeah, it is hard, and maybe you can kind of drop down and try and feel what's going on in your body, and bring your awareness into your belly, and when we get into that level, we could cry, and oh my God, we just should shift into, oh, it's kind of a nice day out. I saw this really nice movie last night, and
Right.
mm,
Mhm. We can't really access that when we're blocking everything off. We block off all the good stuff too. Yeah.
yes, that's right.
Yeah. So I love how you work on all these different levels. So it is important to understand in our cognitive mind.
Mm,
And then we also need to work in the body.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
You can only go so far with the cognitive. And
Right.
that's why I'm trying to empower the cognitive work with the emotional tools of using the healthy anger,
Mhm.
and that gets you down to your anger to protect yourself, and using the healthy tears to cry for yourself, to cry for the terrible losses you have. It's a death. Kubler-Ross, his idea that you get over the death of someone you love by having crying and angering. Well, there's
Right.
all kinds of death, and the death of having a positive relationship with yourself is just one of the worst. And,
Hmm.
and so, helping people get down into that, and I
Hmm.
found in my own meditative process, I had a. I don't have time to say this. I had the key turning point for me is I've been really after emotional release for a long time, and it was improving my life a lot. But I was still stuck in my flat response, being very very busy, and I got sick and lost a lot of weight, and I couldn't play sports anymore. I couldn't go for walks, and I had to, so I had to, all I could do is do more meditation, and I would be sitting in my chair, and I've had minor addictions to coffee and tobacco and too much beer. I could get rid of them without white knuckling. But what I couldn't get rid of was doing. And I'd be sitting in my chair and I'd be white knuckling. I'd meditate for half an hour, 5 minutes, and I'd look up and oh, there's a cobweb up there. I got to clean that.
Right.
Clean a cobweb? You don't dust. What the hell is that about? And I just started to see that I was addicted to just being busy.
Hmm.
And that made me take on this practice, which I got a couple of months to do, of just being with myself. And instead of trying to find the pain, because it was just really clear to me that there was this anxiety in me that I just couldn't stand.
Hmm.
Go up and I'd have try and solve it with thinking. I just
Yeah.
kept trying to stay with it. Then I could feel it in my muscles, all over my body, and stay with it. And it was to me like that's where my meditation is going to go. That's the somatic work for me. That's what I call in my homesteading book, minding the body, bringing the mind into the body. I want my mind in my whole body. And what really helped my meditation would be if I had a little ache or a pain somewhere, because it would make it easier to stay there. And if nothing else, it was a rest from thinking.
Yes, true.
And so that's how I meditate to these days. And that really deconstructed my flight response, and anxiety is rarely an issue for me anymore.
Hmm.
Now I have to work with the depression underneath that, and it's a little harder to do with meditation. I find for me it's can be a foggy sensation in my head and
Hmm.
sore eyes, and for a long time I didn't realize that my head's my body because there's this whole thing, get out of your head, right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And I realized, no, boy, when I get that foggy kind of thing, I start to freak. It's kind of like, oh my, that depression's back. I'm just
Yeah.
going to stay with that. I can often wake up in that, and a half-hour meditation on that, and um, then I truly wake up. I'm not in the
Right.
fatigue anymore, and yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it's total radical self unconditional self acceptance.
Yes. Yeah. Where nothing we find is something we need to shame ourselves for or disconnect about.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. So, how do people get hold of you? Can you just say your website name?
Yeah, it's pete-walker.com.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I guess fortunately for me, but unfortunately, I have to respond to a lot of emails that I don't have any availability in the foreseeable future. But
Mhm.
sometimes I can refer to people. I'm so happy to be able to refer to you.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Thank you.
yeah.
Mm. Yeah, so you're still working as a therapist. Are you doing that from home now on Zoom or something or
Yes, I know. I'm not doing it on Zoom. I'm doing it on the phone.
on the
Um,
phone? Okay.
yeah. I do have an office, and I look forward to being back in it. But I'm semi-retired. I've got about half the caseload I used to have. I do a lot of work on answering people's emails
Mhm.
and questions.
Right. And so one thing they can find on there is the 13 steps around emotional flashbacks, which would be very helpful.
They can, and they can find in the inner critical article, uh,
Mhm.
which is on the website on the left hand side. They can find the 14 responses to inner critic attacks.
Right.
They
Yeah.
can cut and paste that.
Mhm. Yeah, those are very helpful. I refer people to that a lot. And your books are excellent. They're so comprehensive and, it's based on your own experience and it really shines through that you've worked on all of these levels. It's not just in the thinking brain, that you've really worked these through your whole life and your body and your whole system, and you can really tell that through your books and your work. So
Yeah.
thank you for sharing that with us.
One of the nicest and consistent feedbacks I get is that, and I have really had to do a lot of fighting with my psychological training to do this, that the self-disclosiveness of
Um,
what I've struggled with, what I continue to struggle with, really helps de-shame people. And I'm trying to inspire other therapists to learn how to work with that more. Because
mhm,
otherwise, they get stuck in the I'm the healed one and you're the defective one.
right.
And I think what's really the last frontier with healing from complex PTSD is letting go of the salvation fantasy that I'm finally going to get to this place where I'm peaceful all the time, or happy all the time, or feeling loving all the time. It dies a hard death, dies many deaths,
It does.
but
Yeah.
but you can definitely get to a place where flashbacks occur less often,
Hmm.
less intensely, um, and less in duration. And
Right. And where you really don't believe the inner critic anymore.
you really don't believe the inner critic. I, I, it's one of the great rewards I find of this work is I've just really kicked my
Hmm.
inner critic's ass, and then I can push it away very quickly. I may still have to deal with some feelings of depression, but usually not shame. It's like, and boy, I was nothing but shame for 50 years, 40 years anyway.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's where the freedom is, when we don't have that
Yeah.
torturing us all the time anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some
Yeah.
meditative practices say, so we're on somewhat controversial is you got to accept everything. And a lot of people say that about the inner critic. And I think for a normal neurotic person that hasn't been traumatized, you can probably shrink the critic without having to try and exorcise it and
Hmm.
shut it down. But until I started doing that, I was just really not getting anywhere. And I feel justified in doing it is that it's not a natural part of the self. It
Right.
really comes from a toxic process, not
Yeah.
being allowed to develop the healthy ego, the self supportive, user friendly manager. And you
Right.
got to make room for it.
Right. Hmm. Yeah, I think that's important. A lot of times people will be hesitant to talk back to the critic.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we need to be careful, just like we would take ourselves away from an abusive person. We need to take ourselves away from an abusive inner critic too.
Yeah. Because basically, that abusive parent that we had is the inner critic. And
Right.
a lot of time you won't get a visual on it, but it's totally their belief system about you that's ruling it. And it's not fair. It shouldn't have happened. Somebody should have protected you from it.
Hmm.
So I think it's really healthy to fight toxic shame, the emotional side of it, and the
Hmm.
inner critic, the cognitive side of it. And it can be shrunk. And if it doesn't, it really keeps you stuck in a really painful place.
Hmm. Well, and with our current understanding in some of these ways that we talk about and that we work with now, it's really possible. I mean, I see it happen over and over. I'm sure you do too. That in our own lives and with other people, this is possible.
It's really possible. And especially coming back to all the wonderful groups that are online
Right? Yeah.
and the podcasts and a lot of people I know that talk about how a group heals shame quicker than even individual therapy.
Yeah.
And I really like a lot of these groups that are out there right now.
Hmm.
Reddit, Reddit slash r slash narcissist, raised by narcissist is a terrific group that people tell me a lot about.
Right.
It
Yeah.
really helps to see people struggling with the same syndrome and see that no, it's not your defective. You got defective parenting,
Right.
and you're stuck in parenting yourself that way. But here's you can retrain yourself. You can
Mhm.
allow for the development of the natural instinct that every person is born with to love themselves, to like themselves, to be on their own side. You can end the cycle of changing addictions by going for the pain. That a pain is a clarion beacon of hope, even though it's hard to open to, but you can by opening to your pain with compassion, you can really learn to not be afraid of it anymore and to metabolize and work it through so much more efficiently.
That's a wonderful thing to know.
Yeah,
That's true.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, it too, and it's lovely to see.
Welcome to the 2021 Radical Recovery Summit, presented by the Kilby Center for Recovery. This is Lynn Fraser, your moderator. This year, our theme is Feel It, Heal It, a new paradigm of recovery, featuring a diverse group of thought leaders and innovators, people who are working on the ground in the new field of addiction recovery. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to sign up and watch free.